The arrival of the Kalar ambassador. Commander Julia Armstrong stood on the observation deck of Station Avalon, her gaze fixed on the distant stars beyond the reinforced glass. The station was a technological marvel, floating quietly in the neutral sector of the galaxy, far from the territories of any warring factions. But today, it felt like the calm before the storm. The reason was simple. A diplomatic mission was arriving, one that had the potential to shake things up. The Kalar Empire, the most powerful and feared alien faction in the galaxy, was sending their ambassador to the station. And with the Kalar, there was always more at play than just negotiations. Julia could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As the commander of Avalon, she was responsible not only for the station's safety, but for managing all diplomatic missions that passed through. Over the years, she had dealt with many alien species, each one bringing its own challenges, but none were like the Kalar. Their reputation for arrogance and ruthless calculation preceded them. Julia had studied the Kalar for years, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the man, if you could even call him that, who was about to step off the ship. The Kalar ambassador, Ziraxis, was a legend among his people. He was known for his unshakable pride and his ability to dominate any conversation, any room, any situation. Julia had seen footage of him in meetings with other commanders, pushing them to the edge of their patience. He did not respect humanity, and by extension, he saw anyone who wasn't Kalar as inferior. That made him dangerous, and Julia knew that danger wasn't just limited to politics. It could spill into violence if things went wrong. "Commander, the ship is almost in position." Lieutenant Scott Donovan's voice broke her from her thoughts. He was standing beside her, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the dim light of the observation deck. His dark eyes were fixed on the Kalar vessel as it moved closer to the docking bay. The ship itself was a masterpiece of alien engineering, sleek and foreboding, with sharp angles and a surface that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Understood, Lieutenant," Julia replied, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. She had led her crew through dangerous missions and hostile territories before, but this was a different kind of threat. "Make sure the security teams are in place. I want everything ready for his arrival." "Aye, Commander," Donovan responded, his face hardening as he moved toward the communications console. Julia turned her attention back to the ship. The Kalar vessel hovered in front of the docking bay, its massive engines humming as they slowly powered down. The lights from the station reflected off its dark, obsidian-like hull. It was a stunning sight, but not one that Julia appreciated right now. To her, it was a reminder of just how powerful the Kalar were, and how they would use that power to test every human they met. The ramp of the Kalar ship began to lower with a slow, deliberate motion. The hiss of pressurized air escaped as the hatch opened, revealing the imposing figure of Zirax. His silhouette was framed by the doorway, towering over everyone on the docking bay. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his body covered in dark, shimmering scales that caught the dim light and reflected it in iridescent hues of purple and black. His broad shoulders and muscular frame only served to enhance his already intimidating presence. But it wasn't just his size that made him fearsome, it was the air of superiority that surrounded him. Julia could already sense the arrogance in the way he carried himself, his slow, deliberate movements, as though he had all the time in the galaxy to get where he needed to go. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. Everyone would wait for him. A low murmur spread among the gathered security personnel as the Kalar entourage began to disembark. Zirax was followed by 3 of his guards, each one more imposing than the last, their cold, calculating eyes scanning the room, checking for any sign of weakness. They were formidable warriors, loyal to Zirax, and their presence made it clear that no one, not even Julia, was meant to cross the ambassador. The Kalar ambassador's eyes locked onto Julia as soon as he stepped onto the docking bay, and she felt an icy chill run down her spine. His golden irises glinted, sharp and calculating, as though he were already assessing her worth, or lack thereof. The air between them seemed to crackle with an unspoken challenge, and Julia could sense that this encounter was not going to be simple. "Commander Julia Armstrong," Zrax's voice rumbled, his tone smooth but laced with an unmistakable layer of condescension. "I trust this station has been prepared to meet my expectations." Julia stepped forward, holding her ground. "Ambassador Zrax, welcome to Station Avalon. Everything has been prepared to your specifications. I will personally ensure your comfort during your stay." Zrax's golden eyes flicked over her, the faintest trace of a smirk curling the corner of his lips. How quaint. I had expected someone more suited to my status. Not this. He motioned to the human crew around them, who stood at attention, trying their best to remain professional despite the palpable tension. Julia remained unfazed. "I assure you, Ambassador, my credentials are more than suitable for the task. The Federation has entrusted me with this station for a reason." "Is that so?" Zrax mused, his voice dripping with mockery. "I would expect nothing less from the Federation, a species that has yet to truly understand the art of power." Julia's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. There was no point in engaging in petty verbal sparring. Not yet, at least. She had bigger concerns, like ensuring the safety of everyone on the station, especially if things escalated with Zrax. "Follow me," Julia said, her voice firm. "I'll take you to the conference room, where we can begin our discussions." Zrax gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes never leaving her as he strode past her. His guards flanked him, each step a quiet thud against the metal floor, their movements calculated and precise. As Julia led the way through the winding corridors of Station Avalon, she could feel Zrax's eyes on her, measuring her every move. He was looking for weaknesses, just like every Kalar did when they interacted with humans. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of finding any. "The Federation has done well to fortify this station," Zrax commented, his voice surprisingly respectful for once. "But I doubt your measures will stand up to the Kalar if we decide to test them." Julia kept her gaze straight ahead. "You're free to inspect our defenses, Ambassador. But I assure you, they're more than capable of handling anything you throw at them." Zrax chuckled, a low, gravelly sound that reverberated off the walls. "We shall see, Commander. We shall see." They arrived at the conference room, and Julia gestured for Zrax to enter first. He walked in with a fluid, almost predatory grace, his entourage following in his wake. Julia stood at the threshold for a moment, watching the ambassador's every move, every glance he cast over the room. She knew this was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come. "Shall we begin?" Zrax's voice broke through her thoughts, and Julia nodded, stepping into the room and signaling the start of what would undoubtedly be a long and challenging diplomatic negotiation. But as the door slid shut behind them, Julia knew this was more than just a meeting. This was a battle of wills, and it was one she couldn't afford to lose. The power struggle begins. The heavy doors to the conference room slid shut with a soft hiss, sealing the chamber in silence. The faint hum of the station's energy systems could be heard in the background, but for Julia Armstrong, it was drowned out by the palpable tension in the air. Ambassador Zrax, the imposing Kalar envoy, had taken his seat at the far end of the polished, oval-shaped conference table. His golden eyes flickered as he surveyed the room, taking in every detail with that predatory, calculating gaze of his. Julia could almost feel him measuring her, testing her, as if he were determining whether she was worthy of his attention. She wasn't afraid. At least, she refused to be. Julia had faced far more dangerous adversaries than an arrogant alien ambassador. Still, she knew that this meeting, far more than any she had encountered, would test her abilities as a leader, strategist, and diplomat. The future of the Federation's relationship with the Kalar Empire was at stake. "Commander Armstrong," Zrax began, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I trust you've prepared the terms of this negotiation. I hope you understand that my time is valuable, and I do not intend to waste it on trivial matters." Julia stood tall, her back straight, and her expression unwavering. She had spent weeks preparing for this day, ensuring that every possible scenario had been accounted for. The Federation's goals were clear: secure mining rights in the Kalar-controlled sector, gain access to new technology, and form an alliance that would strengthen humanity's position in the galaxy. But she also knew the Kalar had their own agenda, and their demands would not come easily. "I've prepared a comprehensive proposal, Ambassador," Julia replied calmly, her voice firm yet respectful. "But before we begin, I want to make one thing clear. The Federation will not be bullied into agreeing to terms that are unfair or detrimental to our people. We seek an equitable partnership." Zirax raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Equitable? How quaint. You misunderstand the nature of power, Commander. In the Kalar Empire, there is no such thing as equity. There is only strength, and those who possess it rule. You would do well to remember that." Julia felt a flash of irritation surge through her, but she kept her composure. She had been warned that Zirax's arrogance was legendary, but dealing with it face to face was another matter entirely. "Strength does not always mean domination, Ambassador," Julia said, her voice steady but firm. "True strength comes from cooperation, understanding, and mutual respect. That's what we're offering today." Zirax chuckled, a low and guttural sound that made Julia's skin crawl. "Respect. You speak of respect as if it's something you can earn through pleasantries and well-chosen words. I find that amusing." His golden eyes glinted with amusement. "Tell me, Commander, do you think your Federation is strong enough to stand up to the Kalar? You, humans, with your short lifespans and limited reach. Your so-called strength is nothing compared to what my people have achieved." Julia's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had heard this rhetoric before, from other alien species who had underestimated humanity's resolve. Zirax's words were meant to provoke, to make her question everything she knew about human strength, but Julia was no stranger to challenges. She had faced them all her life, growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Earth, joining the military, and earning her place as the commander of one of the Federation's most vital stations. She would not let this alien, with his inflated sense of superiority, undermine her. "Our strength isn't in our numbers, Ambassador," Julia said slowly, her words deliberate. "It's in our ingenuity, our determination, and our ability to adapt. We faced extinction more than once, but we're still here, and we will continue to be here, long after your empire has faded into history." Zirax's expression shifted, the mockery fading into something more dangerous. His eyes narrowed, and the air between them thickened with the weight of unspoken threats. "You talk too much, Commander. It seems you've forgotten your place." His gaze flicked over to his guards, who stood silently at the rear of the room, their eyes sharp and alert. Julia didn't flinch. She had expected this, expected him to try to assert his dominance. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing he had rattled her. "I know my place," Julia replied coolly. "But I also know that I don't need to be reminded of it every time we meet." There was a long, tense silence as Zirax studied her, his golden eyes unreadable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Very well, Commander. I will admit you are more interesting than I thought. But that will not change the fact that the Kalar Empire does not deal with inferior species lightly." The implication hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, and Julia felt the weight of his words. She had to keep her focus. She had to remember that this was not a personal encounter, but a professional one. Zirax's attempt to intimidate her was just another tactic in the larger game of diplomacy. "We don't expect special treatment, Ambassador," Julia said, her voice steady. "But we will not accept being treated as if we are inferior. We are here to negotiate, not to be lectured." Zirax's smirk returned, this time with a cruel edge. "Very well. If you wish to proceed in that manner, Commander, then let's begin." He leaned forward, his intense gaze fixed on her. "But be warned, this negotiation will not be easy. I will not give you what you want simply because you ask for it." Julia's mind raced as she prepared to unveil the proposal she had so carefully crafted. She knew this would be a battle of wills, one that would push both sides to their limits. But she was ready. The Federation was counting on her, and she would not fail them. "Let's get started then," Julia said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'll lay out our terms, and we can begin the process of finding common ground." The room was silent for a moment, and then Julia activated the holoscreen at the center of the table. A detailed projection of the mining rights and trade routes the Federation was seeking appeared, glowing in the dimly lit room. Zrax's eyes flickered over the data, his face impassive. As he studied the display, Julia couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a negotiation. It was a test of humanity's strength and resilience. It was a chance to prove that humans weren't just a footnote in the galaxy, but a force to be reckoned with. Zrax's voice broke the silence, smooth and cold. "Interesting, but ultimately irrelevant. Your proposal will not satisfy the Kalar." Julia's heart sank, but she didn't show it. She had expected resistance, but not this level of disdain. Still, she knew the game had only just begun. "We'll see about that," she said, a glimmer of defiance in her eyes. The tension escalates. The room was thick with silence as Ambassador Zrax's golden eyes remained locked on the holoscreen, flicking between the projected data and Julia Armstrong. The sharp lines of his reptilian features seemed to soften only slightly as he analyzed the Federation's proposal, but Julia could tell that he was far from impressed. His distaste for human negotiating tactics was apparent in every line of his posture. Leaned back, arms crossed, and the subtle but telling way his tail twitched behind him. "Do you honestly believe this will suffice?" Zrax's voice was low, dripping with condescension. "This proposal is an insult, Commander. It reeks of desperation, not strength. A pathetic attempt to disguise your incompetence in the face of real power." Julia resisted the urge to react. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, anticipating every move, every remark. Zrax was known for being difficult in negotiations. His empire, after all, was built on strength and domination. To him, a request for trade rights or mining privileges was beneath him. Everything he wanted had to be earned, not requested. "I disagree, Ambassador," Julia replied, her voice firm but carefully measured. "This proposal is the result of extensive research and strategic planning. It reflects a mutually beneficial arrangement, one where both parties can thrive." Zrax made a noise that was halfway between a laugh and a growl, a sound so unsettling it made the hair on the back of Julia's neck prickle. "Thriving," he repeated with mockery in his tone. "How quaint. You speak as though your species has anything to offer the Kalar that is worth our time." His golden eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Julia felt a pang of anger, but she quelled it instantly. "Perhaps you've forgotten, Ambassador, that the Kalar are not the only ones who can be of use to the galaxy. Humanity is resilient. We adapt. We innovate. And we don't need your approval to continue our expansion." Zrax leaned forward, his claws clicking on the metal table with a sharp, resonating sound. "What your people fail to understand is that the Kalar Empire does not need to adapt. We conquer. We take. We rule. That is the only law we follow." Julia took a slow, deliberate breath. The Kalar were known for their brutal imperialistic ways, and Zrax was no different. He believed in the absolute dominance of his people over all others. To him, the idea of peaceful negotiation was laughable. But Julia was not here to give up. The Federation had invested too much in this relationship for her to back down now. "Your way of ruling," Julia began slowly, choosing each word with care, "has made you powerful, yes, but it's also made you enemies. We've seen how the galaxy reacts to the Kalar. You are feared, Ambassador, but there is no love for you, and fear is a fragile thing." Zirax's eyes flashed, a dangerous gleam flickering in the depths of his gaze. You think you can lecture me on my empire's way of life, human? Your words are nothing but a distraction. He stood up abruptly, his massive form looming over the table. The tension in the room thickened as his entourage of Kalor guards moved closer, their presence suffocating. Julia remained standing, not allowing herself to flinch at the display of intimidation. You may have your federation, Commander, but I have the Kalor. And my people are used to taking what we want, Zirax said, his voice low and deadly. So I suggest you rethink your mutual benefit nonsense before we get to the real heart of this negotiation. Julia stood her ground, despite the growing tension. You may take what you want, Ambassador. But the Federation isn't interested in being another of your conquered worlds. We will not be intimidated. Zirax looked at her for a long moment, his sharp eyes gleaming in the low light of the conference room. A slow, chilling smile curled across his lips. I admire your courage, Commander. For now. But it will be the last thing you have to rely on when I make my demands. The room fell silent. The atmosphere had become so thick with hostility that Julia could almost taste it on the back of her tongue. But she refused to let him see her discomfort. Instead, she calmly nodded toward the holoscreen, where the mining rights proposal was still projected. The terms remain as they are, Julia said, her voice colder than before. If you want to proceed with this negotiation, you'll have to accept the terms we've offered. No more, no less. Zirax's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as if searching for some hidden weakness, some telltale sign that would allow him to exploit her. But Julia didn't waver. She had been through enough to know that if she showed even the slightest crack in her resolve, Zirax would exploit it to his advantage. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Zirax gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Very well, Commander. We shall continue this farce for now. But mark my words, this will not be the end of it. Julia's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face neutral. She had won this round, but she knew the Kalor would not give up so easily. This was merely the beginning of a much more complex game. As Zirax and his entourage began to file out of the room, Julia turned to her security officers, who had been silently standing at attention in the corner. She could see the concern in their eyes, but they knew better than to question her in front of the Kalor. Lieutenant Donovan, keep an eye on the Kalor delegation. I want no surprises, Julia ordered. We need to be prepared for whatever Zirax decides next. Aye, Commander, Donovan replied, his tone filled with the quiet determination that Julia had come to rely on. The door closed behind Zirax and his entourage, leaving Julia alone in the conference room. She exhaled slowly, her muscles tense from the intense interaction. Her mind raced as she replayed every word, every movement, every shift in Zirax's demeanor. He was testing her, pushing her limits, trying to see how far he could go before breaking her. But Julia would not be broken. Not today. Not ever. As she looked out the small window at the stars beyond, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much more complicated. Zirax had only begun to show his hand, and Julia had no illusions about the depth of his cunning. The Kalor were not a species that played fair. But Julia Armstrong wasn't just a commander. She was a symbol of the Federation's resolve, and she would do whatever it took to ensure that humanity's place in the galaxy was secure.